theories is that social emotional learning is yet another example of something that is generally positive that has been co-opted by bad people to do bad things. So it's a contextual kind of thing that we frequently see with these kind of critical theory approaches that wind up in schools or corporations or government or whatever. Social emotional learning was originally developed for when you have these kind of kids that are struggling, they can't get along with other kids, they're in fights, they're upset, they have trouble at home, whatever the case may be, is to try to up their skills for dealing with their emotions and their say, as a mathematician, I often saw very frustrated math students, and sometimes they get very upset. And to learn to control your emotions, for example, is a valuable skill for people who, whether it's because of the math lesson or because of the social setting that you're in or because of something going on at home, is a very useful thing. And so social emotional learning was meant primarily for kids who were struggling with social and emotional aspects that would then get in the way of their learning achievement. And as an original program, I think it was not necessarily poorly conceived, but it has a context, right? When I was a kid, I don't know exactly everything that goes on in schools now, but we had like speech class for the kids who couldn't articulate or enunciate correctly. And the thing is most kids didn't go to speech class, but if you couldn't say squirrel or whatever other word, you had to go to speech class. So the idea would be, now imagine that it's no longer about, enunciation or phonics or any of this kind of thing. And now we're switching it into a psychological kind of the thing that you would expect a school counselor or even a professional counselor to maybe work with. Now imagine taking that out of the context of you have a child who's struggling with his emotion or his social setting or his stuff that's coming up at home that's interfering with his studies that you might deal with in a one-on-one or small group setting, and then you put it in the classroom for everybody, being run by a third grade teacher whose job is not to be a psychological counselor in an uncontrolled setting full of children. So you can see that it's been taken out of its original context and it rapidly becomes poison in that regard. Now, as far as something like critical race theory goes, where I would be much more expert to talk about what that is and what it does, the social aspect of social emotional learning and the emotional aspect are both kind of, if you think of it, I know it's a weird metaphor to use, but we're all kind of familiar right now because of the pandemic. We're all kind of familiar with how viruses work. Mm-hmm. We all heard about the ACE2 receptor, and that's where the spike protein and all this. So cells have certain receptors in which, viruses are able to attach to those things and inject their material. Well, the idea, like in social emotional learning, has social awareness as one of the 5 big pillars. Well, social awareness can be actually, what's the social circumstances that you're in? How do you fit in with your group? Or it can very easily be turned into this whole power dynamics. How do you fit in an oppressor versus an oppressed context? So the critical theory, say of race or gender or whatever, is very easy to insert, like an attachment, like those receptor sites for a virus. And then the critical theory comes in and say, we have to understand the social component this way. And then these critical theories also they say that being too rational is actually an aspect of whatever the dominant culture is, whether it's white, whether it's masculine, whether it's capitalist, whatever it happens to be. And so they can use that emotional side to say that now we're not just going to work on, kids who have trouble regulating their emotions or understanding their emotions or with emotional aspects of their life that's interrupting their ability to learn. They're going to be able to come in and say, we have to understand that emotion is a valid way of knowing, and that emotion is going to be tied to your social context, yada, yada, yada. And so you can see how SEL becomes kind of a Trojan horse with critical theory hiding inside. So, we have this idea, social emotional learning. It helps certain kids. Maybe it helps all the kids. Let's take it out of its regular context. Let's blow it out to a common core program where now it's in math class where it doesn't belong, as opposed to, special small group or individual interventions with kids who are having a hard time. And then let's just shuttle in this oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. Let's make everything about the way that power dynamics make you feel, and make everything about basing your knowledge in whether or not you've experienced this form of discrimination or this form of oppression or whatever they want to call it, and make every lesson be about how bad that is and how that interrupts learning. And then how the educational program has to be remade from the ground up in accordance with, say, the critical theory of race or the critical theory of gender or whatever, to facilitate that, because these people have the incredible pretense of believing that they are A, qualified to engage in social and psychological interventions in classroom settings with children, and B, that they have a working understanding of anything like race or gender or whatever, when actually what they have is a very shallow, naive, and in fact Marxian understanding of those phenomena.
I think that was a perfect summary. And one of the questions I have for you in terms of inserting critical race theory into some of these vehicles or Trojan horses, like something such as social emotional learning that may have been developed with good intentions, once the virus gets in, is it possible to separate it again? So, for example, the bureaucrats in the North Carolina Department of Instruction will say, no, there's no CRT here in social emotional learning. We're just using the very basic surveys that don't have the identity matrices on it, just to make sure that that allocations are going to where they're supposed to go. So can any parent trust that at this time in this year in education? Or is there any way to expel the virus, or does the whole thing just need to crumble?
So those are two questions. No, parents can't trust anything that is being put out by one of these official administrative bodies right now. Absolutely nothing. What I continue to run into is kind of this mixture of two things, and I can't claim in any given individual, especially if I don't know them, which one is dominant, which one is maybe the only motivation, if there's some mixture. But it's a mixture of fully believing in this program and ignorance about what this program actually is, and meaning critical theory in particular. So a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, we're not talking about critical race theory. Those words never appear, but every lesson has something to do with racial equity, racial justice, racial privilege or whatever. Any of this identity-based stuff that's talking about equity, privilege, et cetera, is carrying this, that the viral DNA or RNA or whatever is in there. And no, parents can't actually trust these administrators or the school board members to tell them the truth, either out of ignorance or because these entities, these bodies, these administrations are filled with people who will misrepresent this stuff willfully to keep it going on. And like I said, I can't parse how much in any given individual or any given board of those two factors it is, but I see it basically in every school board in the country. So no, parents can't trust it. Now, can it be taken out? Well, of course it can. If the curriculum could be changed to this, and I'm not saying it's a short-term thing, it can be changed away from this. And so taking the focus off of privilege, off of equity, off of oppressor versus oppressed, off of identity, as a matter of fact, all of that is very straightforward, focusing on actual, achievement-based curriculum like basic mathematics, reading, literacy, scientific literacy and competence. All of those things are curricular changes and programming changes that can easily be made. The problem occurs when you either have administrators and teachers who are ignorant of it and going along with it thinking it's good. I see multicultural communities. This is not what should be going on. And then secondly, you have many others who actually think this is the way of the future. And until those problems are cleared up, both ignorance and the insertion of people who have no business. I mean, granted, it's not as bad as this probably in most places in North Carolina, but we just saw the thing in California with the literal Antifa teacher literally teaching, revolution and revolt against the country to children. And he got busted. And it's probably not that bad in most school districts in North Carolina, or I'm in Tennessee. But you do have people who are on board with this, who are present, who infiltrate these administrations. So there is no trust. And until that problem can get cleared up by putting more trustworthy people into the positions of administration and school boards and power, and starting to do some kind of an audit on curriculum and on teachers and on everything related to it, the problem's going to persist. I see the comment. I know North Carolina. I know all 50 states have teachers like this.
Yeah.
I assume there are probably more in California and more than likely in Virginia than anywhere else, because I shouldn't say that. Oregon and Washington exist too, but because those are kind of the biggest hotbeds of this problem.
Well, you're missing Austin. We have 26 different states, and I will tell you that Austin may be the most radical between Austin and Durham, James, just for the record.
Well, we have a person very similar to the Antifa teacher here at UNC Chapel Hill campus for freshmen required class, and he looks almost like his twin. So the problem here in Chapel Hill is significant, and it's definitely driven down into the schools.
So the problem, just like how they infiltrate or hijack a concept like social emotional learning, Marxists, and I say that without the slightest reservation, Marxists have for a very long time worked very hard to infiltrate various institutional structures, various administrative positions. And our society for about 50 years or so, or maybe a little longer, has been way too tolerant of allowing Marxists to pose as professionals.
Right.
They are not professionals. They are not. I don't think there are such things any longer. Very few Marxist college professors. There are Marxists posing as college professors.
Yeah.
There are no Marxist school administrators or Marxists posing as school administrators to try to forward the ideas of Marxism. And Marxism only does one thing. It doesn't matter if it's with race. It doesn't matter if it's with gender. It doesn't matter if it's with capitalism and consumerism. It doesn't matter which species of Marxism it is. It only does one thing, is it works to generate, well, I guess two related things. It works to generate consciousness, meaning a Marxist consciousness in everybody that it can reach. Easiest to do that in children, of course.
Right.
And it tries to occupy positions of influence and power that enable them to do that without being stopped. And so that's two related things, I guess. But really the one goal is to bring everybody into their crooked upside down religion. And so it's just like if we had some creepy priest taking up positions in schools, doing creepy priest stuff in schools. We would say that we have a priest posing as an educator to do whatever it is. Or if there's pedophiles, we would say it's pedophiles posing as educators to do what they want to do. Marxists operate in the exact same way. Their one objective is to raise a Marxist consciousness. If it's critical race theory, they raise a critical consciousness of race. If it's critical gender theory, they raise a critical consciousness of gender. If it's classic Marxism, they raise a critical consciousness of class. And the goal is to inspire this disaffected, alienated, aggravated group, who they are disaffecting, alienating, and aggravating, to make them that way, to inspire them to want to reject the society that they live in and replace it with a new one under Marxist control. That's the whole project. And it's very unfortunate that it's come to this point where a significant number of people who education might be, of all of the sectors of our society, the worst in terms of the level of its infection. They realized in the 1970s that blowing up buildings and taking federal judges hostage at gunpoint was not an effective way. It wasn't moving the public. And they instead, most of these people actually became K through 12 activists. Most of the radicals of the 60s and 70s became K through 12 activists. They realized that taking over the schools was going to be the way to win generational warfare for their liberation project that they believe that they're engaging in. And so you see, I mean, a lot of in fact, the Weatherman Underground, which was an incredibly radical organization, took over the schools. And so they see these things, as just to kind of bring it back a little bit to what we're talking, the subject, they see these things like social emotional learning that get developed probably with good intentions and even to good results. And then they hijack them. And then they take the research that showed, oh, look at this effect that it had on these particular kids, and say, look how successful it is. Now we're going to put it on everybody. And they're using it as a vehicle to poison things. And then, like you said, they can hide behind, like these administrators, either out of ignorance, if they're kind of a so-called useful idiot, or if they're willful perpetrators of it, they can hide behind the language and say, oh, well, we're not teaching CRT. This is social emotional learning. It's different. We use culturally responsive teaching, which is also CRT, that is somehow different. But these things are just used to, again, they grab onto these things and hijack them to their purposes, and take them out of their usual context specifically so they can do that. And this is whether it's the role of a principal in a high school, or whether it's the role of social emotional learning or culturally responsive teaching as a project. They hijack these things and turn them to their purposes of turning everybody into people who hate their society and think in terms of oppressor versus oppressed conflict dynamics.